Good evening, dear friends. Thank you so much for coming to STRELKA's public program. This is our first event we are doing in collaboration with the Embassy of Sweden in Moscow. We have planned quite a large program with Swedish speakers, and this is the first event of the series. I'd like to present our lecturer, Mr. Håkan Forsell. He's a professor of the Stockholm University, professor of history, and he's specializing on various demographic issues of the Nordic countries. I really hope you'll enjoy the lecture, and please come again.
Thank you for the invitation. I will just I've been cold the whole day here in Moscow, and I tried to find a sweater or something, but I didn't. I think we went to the wrong streets. So I will look like this talking to you. I hope that is no problem. Let me start by saying something. So I bring you into the picture of what I'm supposed to talk about, give you a general overview of. In 3 years, me and a colleague, we have been doing a radio show, a podcast, you know, the radio programs you listen to and download on the internet about urban development. And I have to be quite open with you. I think this was an excellent opportunity to talk about something I never tried to talk about before, and to think more about what we actually have been doing with this radio show, talking about urban development in different parts of Europe and the world. I also wanted to take this opportunity to think more in academic terms around this project that started more as a hybrid of popular education and, I would say, new journalism with research-informed discussions. We have, I would just say this, if you are cold or something like that, I will not talk for like an hour. So I will try to keep this fairly short, and then I hope we can have some questions, because that is interesting also for me. We have for 3 years been traveling and observing cities and towns in Europe, the United States, and in Minor Asia. We have tried to find the most important, perhaps the most burning and controversial questions for each individual town, to find the spot where it hurts. And in this quest we have talked to and listened to planners, architects, artists, researchers, and ordinary people that pass in our way during our trips. This definition of where it hurts is not objective, of course. Politicians and people of power do not seldom have different views on the issues concerning where it hurts in urban development, where the problem actually is in individual cities of today. But our focus has been uncompromised, been the everyday experience out of the everyday movement and routines in urban society. It is the somehow ordinary questions and problems of urban society that we have wanted to address. And not least, since we wanted to be general and broad in some way, and to see our work as belonging into the field of popular education. So combining research-informed questions and examples of cities and urban issues with a journalistic and popular science approach, of accessibility for the listener, who has perhaps limited pre-knowledge of urban development or urban history, or a more general interest in the questions addressed. Understanding why cities look and function as they do, or do not function at all, is not really an easy task. There is always a complex prehistory to contemporary issues. Something that happened in the past, a trajectory or a path where each individual town took a decisive turn and became something else. The bearing idea of this podcast is an internet radio show. It's called Stardom in Swedish, which is the city in English. Is that urban societies are historically that urban societies are historical decisions materialized. And in the physical landscape, not only houses and street and metro lines bear the traces of the past decisions and investments and ideologies, but also social and power relations, as well as prevailing structures of class and gender relationships, can be traced to the built environment and be analyzed through the built environment. In short, I would say we have been trying to look for the connection between the shapes of society and the shapes on the ground. I want to give you a few glimpses of how such connection can look like and what we have been talking about when we have visited individual towns. In Lisbon, we found that the small shops that have existed everywhere in the old town, they were poorly invested and maintained. They are often accompanied by a small apartment that was often substandard and seldom modernized. But still, many of them were highly valued by locals and by tourists, creating this atmosphere of Lisbon as an old-fashioned, almost forgotten and at the end of all times town. This small-scale retail shop and rental network has, however, been created politically over the years due to housing policies of the fascist regime of Salazar in the post-war era that heavily subsidized the rental sector in Lisbon and kept the rents so low so that the inhabitants would have no demands for higher wages. The restrictions kept the manufacture wages in Lisbon low, but also slowed almost every reform of the old town of Lisbon, and created also an increasing class difference in the town. In the beginning of the 1990s and continually in the 2000s, this situation created an overwhelming urban sprawl of Lisbon, since the old town of Lisbon was kind of stagnated. Nothing happened. Nobody moved in and nobody moved out. And consequently, after the economic crisis in 2008, whole neighborhoods were severely hit by the crisis of the real estate sector, and houses were abandoned in the outskirts and periphery of the town. My second case, glimpse of this connection between shapes in society and shapes on the ground or in the built fabric of a city, is from Thessaloniki in Greece. Thessaloniki did, during the 1920s, face a catastrophic situation that affected the structure of the urban landscape and the land economy of the city up until today. The violent resettlement of the Greek minority in Asia Minor, Turkey and parts of the coastline of the Black Sea, meant that Thessaloniki in a very short period of time had to accommodate almost 1 million refugees. A land bank and a government-ruled mortgage system, a loan system, was established so that the refugees could buy land and build their own homes in the Thessaloniki region. Out of these very small lots and houses that were erected in scattered places and also in the peripheral, almost rural areas around Thessaloniki, soon developed a building industry connected to the urbanization of the city. In the post-war decades, the land lots were increasingly subjected to real estate speculation. The land were bought with the deal that the original owner were given 2 to 3 apartments of the new erected multi-complex as payment for the land. This system is called the anti-paroxy system in Greece. There's a similar system also in Istanbul, for example, then called yapsat, do sell. It means do sell. It made the city extremely dense, but also created like a mental mindset and understanding, and partly also strong sympathy for the situation of the refugees coming from Asia Minor or for the Eastern Mediterranean areas, since more or less half or even more of the population had relatives going through this process of being urbanized in this anti-paroxy system. And since the 1920s, Thessaloniki is also called the city of refugees. There's several songs also named like that. My third glimpse from shapes in society and shapes on the ground is from Copenhagen. Copenhagen had the ambitions, like my hometown, Stockholm, but Stockholm was more successful in that way, or perhaps not, to rapidly modernize the capital after the Second World War II. But the great modernist and infrastructural plans that completely changed Stockholm during the 50s, 60s and 70s were never implemented in Copenhagen. The city didn't have the money. They suffered from post-war depression, and no resources were laid out for this type of major planning for the modern individual car traffic. Moreover, the Danish society lacked a strong car lobby, as was the case in Sweden, if I continue to compare that, with 2 soon-to-be world-leading car companies were established. Volvo and Saab had enormous economic political influence over urban planning in Sweden in general. There were plans in Copenhagen to rebuild the so-called City West, which meant to actually bulldoze down parts of Vesterbro neighborhood, then deemed a ghetto, to make way for motorways and high-rise development. This proposal was part of a broader 1948 finger plan, drawn up as a long-term vision for the greater Copenhagen area, which would see urban development concentrated along new networks and arterial roads in 5 directions, located along the fingers. But this did not happen. Much to the modernist discontent at the time, Copenhagen's development took a different trajectory. Rather than intelligent foresight or difference in the mindset of those in power, the Danish capital's avoidance of major motorways in their old and dense part of their town is simply down to good fortune. I can quote one of our informants saying, "We thought we were unlucky and very poor at this time in history." She's an infrastructure researcher studying bicycle traffic in Copenhagen. But actually we were very lucky. 5 decades later, Copenhagen continues to retain its historical housing stock, strong bicycle culture, and extensive pedestrian zones. An urban model that many cities around the world now desperately try to copy, or if they can, to turn to in some way. This feels threatening, you know. I could have like water poured over my face in a minute. What? There's no harm to the computer right now. Okay, this is a few examples of our findings and discussions. But for us, it is not only about showing that urban societies are historical decisions materialized, which is almost always intriguing, but at the same time kind of self-evident. It's also about choosing a theme for each show and for each city that we actually can visit, that there is an actual location of a theme where we can take a political walk. In this way, we have tried to integrate fieldwork, or historical field studies, as we call it, with urban, economic, cultural, and ethnographical analysis. The walk has a tradition, and it is an oppositional thing. It's an oppositional act. It opposes not least planning and ungrounded visions of city making, taking it down to earth. During most of the 20th century, the wanderers and walkers in cities had difficulties to measure in the legitimacy and influence with the urban design professionalism. The subjective physical experience of urban environments had been downgraded to local history societies and local heritage advocates. Drifting, or the situationist practiced it in Paris and London and other major cities. I think also Walter Benjamin perhaps practiced it once in Moscow, was a kind of the ideal of daring to get lost with your subjectivity and exploring the industrial city, in this case, by feet and not only by reading books and studies. Walking still offers a resistance to the statistical, calculated and limiting in city building. Walking also infused an uncertainty in a city, and that uncertainty can be seen as a fundamental opportunity rather than a problem for engineers and planners. When we have been walking, traveling and talking about different cities, what have we seen? Yeah, we have visited and explored around 50 cities in these 3 years. Our work could be seen as a bank of separate case studies. What is individual for a city? But taken together, you could also try to use all these cases as something else than only case studies. Instead, we could borrow, or I would try to borrow, a methodological concept that I don't think anybody has used in urban studies before: prosopography. The theoretical approach of prosopography is to seek variations within limited groups of, in this case, individual cities. Prosopon is Greek and means to face. Literally, the method deals with the description of external and material individual characteristics. The principle of prosopography are quite simple. In a way, we might say that it is rather a research approach than a method sui generis, an attempt to bring together all relevant observations of a group of urban societies in a systematic and stereotypic way. It is a system for organizing observations and data in such a way that they acquire significance by revealing connections and patterns of historical process. The prosopographical method consists of describing the material characteristics of a more or less homogeneous group. This is the new thing. I'm into the new thing now. So I have not talked about this before. I thought you would be like a good experimental audience, coming to Moscow and saying something that you never imagined you would say. I will take a leap and try to do exactly that out of our bank of cases and first-hand studies. Try to group them together, the cities. Group them according to some kind of material, political characteristics and what we have been trying to find, perhaps unconsciously, during all the cities that we have been visiting and doing shows about. Today, on a general level, we live in a Europe that has burst into three different parts. Three geo-economic and political areas where different experiences of, I would call it post-crisis and structural upheaval, has been crucial for understanding urban development and policy. Let's try and call it that this is the era of post-development. What do I mean by that? Well, despite the different trajectories and historical contexts, urban societies connect and relate to previous periods of development, to strong political logics from the past, and his architectural languages that has expressed basic and necessary forms in society. This three-parted Europe are you used to this, that it sort of just rains almost on you? Yeah, I'm used to it. Yeah, I'm used to it, okay. I'm trying to keep cool, but the first one of these groups of urban societies in Europe I would call the post-welfare state cities. Our examples, our cases in this group would be London, Vienna, Berlin, Copenhagen, and the three Swedish cities which we obviously also have visited: Uppsala, Kalmar, an old ruling town, and Stockholm. The post-welfare state cities has a strong history of social democratic or social liberal governance, where since the 1990s, more or less a neoliberal and entrepreneurial-oriented political ideals have taken over social political thinking and thinking about how to construct just cities. The second group I would dare to call it here in Moscow, to the post-socialist cities. Our examples would be, so far, Warsaw, Prague, Brno, and Belgrade. We will see if I dare to add Moscow after this visit also to it feels like it would be natural to do that. These post-socialist societies saw an almost Darwinian situation evolve violently in the 1990s. The uncontrolled turn towards a market economy came to bear many wounds in its adaptations. The reaction has not seldom been that of skepticism of the possibilities of development, sometimes revanchism, and sometimes resignation. We could also identify in all these cities a new generation, I would say born in the late 1980s and 1990s, organizing themselves anew, often against forms of sluggish economic and urban development, creating quite substantial groups in some of these cities of civic activists. You could find them in Warsaw and in Belgrade for sure. The last group, I'm sorry I have this, in the lack of a better concept, I choose to call them the post-2008 crisis cities, or the post-economic integration cities. An economic policy sort of colored all these cities that we have visited. Our example is Lisbon, Rome, Naples, and Thessaloniki. Economic policy have colored all these cities. That you can find them mainly in Southern Europe. One exception would be Ireland. They have, during a time of economic development in the 1990s, created a non-sustainable investment and lending situation that fueled for a long time uncontrolled suburbanization of many cities, and not least the cities I have as example here. The burst of the bubble and the austerity measures that came from approximately 2011 led to indignant protests and founding of new parties and corresponding urban movements in cities in Greece, Spain, and Italy. They have been populist, they are populist in some cases, but they have also fostered an activist scene where large groups of academics also participate. Just see what kind of observations and finding we have for each of these prosopographical groups of urban examples. I would say that the recurrent issues around the post-welfare state cities has a lot to do with housing and housing crisis. It goes back to the deregulation of the housing sector in both the Nordic countries, especially Sweden, in Germany, and in the UK. At the same time as housing and real estate has turned into the primacy, the driving force of economic development on a global scale. The second crucial issue for urban development in the post-welfare state cities is migration. It has now, and for some time, been obvious that most of these cities lack a long-term integration strategies when it comes to migration. And you see a continuous segregation on the labor and the housing market out of that problematic situation. The third issue I would raise for this group is infrastructure. There has been for some time deficiencies in investment in public transport. The public transport systems are usually quite old modern investments from the 40s and 50s, fragmented, reinvested. And all these cities have substantial plans to reduce private car use and try to, for example, as Copenhagen as a model, have other means of transport to have a sustainable urban environment. Regarding the post-socialist city groups, a would say that one of the most crucial questions about planning, in most of the cities we have visited from this group in Central and Eastern Europe, you can always observe that there's a patchwork of the urban landscape that characterize urban life in these post-socialist cities. You have shining offices and apartment towers, often neighboring impoverished districts. You have gated communities. I think we observed that, we read somewhere and talked to people that Warsaw is the most gated community dense city in the whole of Europe. Gated community that accompany rundown settlements from the post-war era, this kind of planning patchwork. Also here you can find infrastructure as one of the main issues for this group. Many East European cities have very good public transport from their socialist period, which more or less are taken good care of. Sometimes not, and sometimes it is. But still, these cities are facing the burdens of increasing car traffic, especially since the 1990s, which has been a problem, and none of these cities we have visited has taken like dramatic steps to reduce this infrastructural situation. And last but not least, the post-socialist group, there's a continuous discussion about where the urban economy is going. Many of them, like Brno, has a fundamental industrial heritage to build on, but do not want to be re-industrialized, but rather want to step into the softer room of the knowledge economy, but don't know really how to do it or how to reuse also the physical facilities that they have for hand. I wanted them to come like one by one, but this I must have done something wrong, so you get them all now in one. When it comes to the post-2008 crisis cities located more or less in the southern Europe, one of the major issues for this group in every city we have visited is corruption. It's a factor that dominates the talk about municipal policies and about urban life in general, and it undermines trust and progress. The second issue of importance are the labor market. You can almost always find small family-based structures of work, but no medium-sized or larger company that still can have a productive way to infuse urban life with economy and security. Especially in the Italian and the Greek cities we have visited, there has been a lack of opportunity also for educated professionals that then seek their future somewhere else in Europe or in the United States, for example, or in Asia. Migration has turned up as an issue, but perhaps on another level than in the post-welfare state cities. Here you have meager housing and work opportunity for migrants, and a large group of inhabitants that also stay in the cities as sans-papiers, without papers, and constructing a difficult and problematic dense situation. And last, this issue always come up with infrastructure. It seemed to be like the common thing to worry about and always plan around infrastructure. That in this case, many of these cities are characterized by a very uninvested public transport, halted investments in public transport, and a continuous sector of urban informal housing that also create fragmented landscapes, which is very difficult to integrate into a public transport network. So, hey, now I will soon end. I have tried to summarize the general contemporary features of urban society as taking place in a post-development era. The urban renaissance that has been going on since the early 1990s has, in all groups I've been talking about, been, I would call it, post-political, and increasingly so populist, even a bit Machiavellian perhaps in its contempt for some, partly for both people that policy should represent and for justice issues. Housing, infrastructure and migration turn up as the three key issues that cities have been facing since the beginning of urbanization. And different political cultures of Europe have created various scenarios of dealing with these issues, ranging from conflict to consultation. I have, during this short talk, tried a little bit to theorize and find general patterns for our historical field studies or the political walks that we have undertaken in the radio show, The City. Transformations of meaning are always connected with the cultural background, I would like to say, of society and its history and its structure, its wealth, as well as its aspirations and hopes. And all these are aspects to explore further to better understand the shaping of the urban world that we live in today. So, thank you for listening.
Hello, my name is Dmitry, and my question is regarding your segmentation of these three different types of cities. What do you plan to do with all this work? How do you see the different approaches in developing these three categories of cities, and etc. and etc. Thank you.
Should I answer immediately, or should we collect? I could answer that immediately. Okay, thank you. I like that question because this is as I said, I wanted to do something I haven't done before, and there's a reason for that, and it's because we have been talking about doing some more substantial book project about or connecting to the podcast, and I also want to use all this kind of material for my own research in a more structured way. So this is why I now took it through the academic mill and tried to see what came out of it. Because as I said from the beginning, this podcast and this radio show, its main purpose has been to popular education and not to academic studies. But then when we have so many cases, I started to systematically look into them and see which belong to who. And it's kind of obvious. I mean, you could actually draw this kind of comparison to other social work been done in the 90s about the 3 words of welfare capitalism and Esping Andersen, if you know that work, is grouping them together. It's also a way of simplifying to be able to, on a more general level, see what kind of urban world we are living in, and what essential questions tends to permeate the discussion and also the research being done. And what is new and what I think we have done, which I haven't seen before, is also to have like a popular opinion being influencing the questions we are asking. So this is like an emulation of both what we have read, what we have looked at, but also what we have talked to common people about. What are their issues? What are their problems? So it's a much more, I would say, much more of an ethnographical questionnaire that we have in the background. So, thank you.
So thank you for your election.
Yeah.
Okay, you were very good at keeping calm. If you want.
I'm sorry. Could you take that from the beginning when the microphone starts, so I can? So I didn't hear you. So it's, yeah.
No. Thank you for election, and you were very good at keeping calm. If you want. And do you have any plans to implement some future technologies to your research about smart city? And what is your favorite city?
Okay. So I don't know if you heard the question in the back row. It was the first part of the question was if we have plans to discuss or integrate any aspects of the smart city or the smart city movement. And the second question was, what is my favorite city? I think since I'm in, my background is I'm an economic historian, and this is something quite unusual for an historian to do, being out so much in the field. I mean, you could actually, being an historian, you can actually just step back in the shadows as much as you want, just dealing with things in the past. But since my approach is that urban history is a fundamental thing to understand how our future functions today. We can't understand a city just by dropping down and not understanding what happened before and what kind of legacies do you have to build on. So I see that my work is just to present that kind of perspective and just to do it as good as I can. And if somebody wants to take part of that work and sort of implement it into a smart city discussion, or even a practical case that would even be better, I would welcome it for sure. That would be wonderful. That is like the idea of the thing, that you can take the public educational parts of what we do and just use it for your own purpose. The second question is really, really difficult. If I just have to choose between the ones we have traveled to, I have always been very fond of the city of Brno. I think that is a wonderful city. It has a lot of interesting layers, from medieval times up to industrial times, and beautiful architecture. Yeah, so I would say the Czech city of Brno. But hey, I've been one day in Russia, so I have like the whole continent to explore here. Yeah, sure.
From the beginning, I want to excuse that I will ask my question in English, in Russian, because I'm a little bit shy of my English.
Sorry, I listened to a Russian translation and thought, when will she start speaking English?
Just a moment.
My question is the follows. My question is as follows. In your work, in your research, you split the cities into three groups: the post-welfare countries, the post-socialist countries, and the post-2008 crisis countries. The largest part of these cities can be categorized by geography. The first group of the cities are mainly located in North and Western Europe, second group Central and Eastern Europe, and third group rather Southern Europe. There are exceptions of this link between the type of the group the city belongs and the geography. What are the biggest exceptions that you can highlight?
That is a good question, and it's or a good remark, I would say, because you're absolutely right. There is a geographical connection between them, and they are often neighboring or belonging to the same kind of region. I would say that one exception would be Vienna, belonging to a central, partly also having an urban heritage from an East European tradition, but belonging in this grouping to the post-welfare state cities. And I make that distinction because of the strong social democratic political heritage in exactly that city, not in the country of Austria, but in the city of Vienna. But I mean, this is what you, if you want to, it's like the old gangsters say. I mean, if you want to make an omelette, you have to crack a few eggs. You can't have the eggs like eggs, because then you will not be an omelette. And I would like to eat this tasty omelette. And then you have to simplify things, just to be able to draw what I think, I try to argue for it, not to only think, but like intellectually and research-wise, try to argue that these are the most significant features of urban development. And then I have left things out, of course, because research is a simplification of reality, but hopefully an informed simplification of reality. And I think that when speaking about Central and Eastern Europe, you have, I think you also mentioned it and you sort of hinted on it, you have aspects of other kinds of development also being very important. So I thank you for the remark, because it's always there, you know, where to draw the line, and if you simplify too much, you're not being true to the complexities of society and of history. Okay.
Hello, thank you for
Hello.
your lecture. My name is Yaroslav. I just want to ask, from your point of view, to which group you mentioned does Moscow belongs? Because it has features from actually each of the group.
Yeah, that connects also to the previous question. Yeah, I would say that you're absolutely right. You could have features from all the three. I would not, because I have, as I said, I haven't been more than a day in Moscow, and we are still reading into the city a lot. And we have very informed people accompanying us and seeing the architecture and the plans, talking about the new planning and what has happened after the extension of the city in 2012. We understand is a major question for how to deal with the contemporary urban development of Moscow. It's a city that relies heavily on a good transportation system, of course. But talking to people today, I realized that I did not mention, as part of the post-socialist issues that is really crucial, corruption. But that, of course, could be some kind of exchangeable with the post-crisis cities that I mentioned, because that is also something that is obvious, but has other features in the cities we have been visiting, in Warsaw, for example, Belgrade, very much so, where you had really problems with political instability. So out of not knowing too much, I would of course follow the standard geographical turn and say that Moscow is definitely a post-socialist city. But then I would like to make that more complex. And now I feel inspired by your comment also to perhaps go in that direction and see what other features you could find. Because that is also something that you like when you're systematizing something, when you're making a scheme, a schedule, that you also want to, the purpose is to find new knowledge and not only to state things that everybody already know. So it would be nice and super interesting to find something that could sort of confirm that Moscow would actually belong to another group. Yeah. I guess that means that this is over. So thank you very much for listening, and thank you especially for the very good questions I got. Thank you.